Welcome to this brake testing session. Our aims for today are to take you through the roller brake test report, just to give you an idea of how beneficial it is to use this as a diagnostic tool to gain some knowledge of the performance of your braking system on your vehicles. We'll be running through a few fundamentals today. Not in absolute detail, we've got a 30-minute session. Hopefully we will give you enough insight so that you can go back, have a look at your reports that you're currently receiving, and then perhaps identify some additional support that you'll need just to understand them in a little bit more depth. The session today is going to be delivered by James Backhouse, Director at Backhouse Jones. James has a wealth of experience in these matters, so hopefully we'll be able to provide you with some additional insight into the session. So we'll start with a bit of a background so that you have an understanding of what the current legal and regulatory requirements are. So James, over to you.
Okay, so the brake testing part of the preventive maintenance systems that operators have to deal with has sort of grown legs over the last probably 5 years, with the traffic commissioners and the DVSA placing an increasing focus on the importance of this. That's not to say that it didn't pre-exist this, and many operators historically agreed to undertakings to conduct rolling road brake testing on a periodic basis, typically quarterly. But this increase in focus came as a result of various events about which we're going to talk later, but came also as a result of the traffic commissioners having a look at the legal framework for the operation of vehicles on the road, specifically as regards their braking systems. And that's set out here. The Road Vehicle Construction and Use Regulations are the regulations which specify the design and technical requirements on vehicles when they're being used on the UK road network. And they make specific requirements as regards brakes, one of which is Regulation 18, which says that every part of every braking system and the means of operation thereof fitted to a vehicle shall be maintained in good and efficient working order and be properly adjusted. Now, that is an absolute duty on any driver and employer of a driver who uses a vehicle on the UK road network. When I say it's an absolute duty, it doesn't matter that either the driver or the employer were not aware that a part of the braking system wasn't in good and efficient working order. If it wasn't in good and efficient working order, the offence or the breach of this regulation, which creates an offence, is still committed. It's what's known as a strict liability offence. And it's a duty obviously designed to focus the mind on making sure vehicle braking systems work properly. In addition to that, under your operator's license, you have various undertakings to make proper arrangements to ensure that, amongst other things, vehicles, including hired vehicles and trailers, are kept in a fit and serviceable condition. And most operators, well, all operators who hold a license in the UK, achieve compliance with that undertaking by conducting periodic safety inspections and by drivers conducting walk-round checks and reporting defects when they become apparent. However, the braking system requirement has long been monitored primarily by the use of basically visual checks on the braking system by the fitter who's inspecting the vehicle. And there are a number of items on the PMI safety inspection record specifically focused on the braking system. What the traffic commissioners take the view now is that the requirement to ensure that the entire system is in good and efficient working order cannot simply be met by the fitter conducting visual checks on the vehicles. You have to also have a metered check on the vehicle to meet that obligation. And therefore, when you sign a declaration of roadworthiness, or when your fitter signs a declaration of roadworthiness on the bottom of a PMI inspection record, that fitter must be certain that the braking system is in good and efficient working order before signing the declaration, and they can't be so certain if all they've done is look at it. They have to have actually carried out some form of metered check. So it's that framework which has led to the increased focus on metered rolling road or EBPMS braking systems, and we'll have a look at the obligation as it now is explained in the Guide to Maintaining Roadworthiness in a moment. This has also fed into the annual test requirements. But let's consider why braking systems and their functioning is important, as if it's not obvious. One of the most serious recent incidents involving failure of brakes was the tragic tipper lorry crash in Bath, which killed 4 people and injured a number of others. That incident occurred as a result of brake failure, which ultimately the court determined was as a result of poor maintenance of the braking system or poor maintenance practice within the braking system. Now, I wasn't involved in the case, so I have no detailed knowledge of it, but I know that at a high level, that is essentially what happened, and as a result, 2 people were convicted of serious offences and imprisoned. It is important to recognise that none of the participants in that operation had any intention to cause any harm on that day. And that case really does highlight the significance of the braking system checks that are carried out, whether they're the visual checks or the rolling road and meter checks that are now being required. It brings it into relief because it's well known that operators are not going out there intentionally taking risk. But the idea of these new requirements, or relatively new requirements, is to up the ante, basically, and make an accident like this far less likely in 2025, 2026 than it was historically. Okay, so when you're looking at the braking systems, you also have to be aware that even if it's not a serious accident like that, there are other consequences of getting it wrong. At its basic level, if the brakes aren't performing correctly, for example, at MOT test, when they are put over a rolling road, then the company is going to receive a prohibition notice. And if it's in the view of the examiner that that defect should have been apparent to the fitters, who should have carried out an appropriate check, that prohibition notice will be S-marked, indicating a significant failure in the maintenance arrangements. And that S-marking will usually trigger a further intervention, which might be a full maintenance investigation. So it's not just a prohibition notice which you have to repair. It's usually a trigger for much more serious consequences for you as an operator, which may include, as referred to below, a public inquiry with the Traffic Commissioner, where your licence is at serious risk. The driver may receive a fixed penalty notice. The company can be prosecuted. I've already said, if any part of the braking system isn't in good and efficient working order and properly adjusted, then both the driver and the person employing the driver commit an offence, and it's a strict offence if the vehicle is used on the road. It doesn't matter that you didn't know that the defect was present. The DVSA are likely to conduct further investigation into the company's arrangements, and that may take the form of an MIVR, which is a maintenance investigation visit report, where they turn up, look at vehicles, do a fleet inspection, work through your papers, and work out what's the good, the bad, and the ugly of your maintenance arrangements. And bearing in mind that's being triggered by a prohibition, you are not going to get a perfect result because the prohibition itself will be referred to as unsatisfactory. And there's a pretty high risk that you're going to find yourself before the Traffic Commissioner. And to illustrate that, I had a very large international operator who had a braking system failure at test. Actually, it all led back to a poor rolling road system within their own operation, which wasn't functioning correctly. But that was all academic. From that test, issue, they ended up at public inquiry. They had an excellent prohibition history and they had an excellent MOT test history as a business. One prohibition for one braking defect on one occasion, and they were at public inquiry. And they were a large, international, well-funded, well-resourced, well-motivated, and well-managed business, if there aren't too many wells in that. Okay, so systems failing within your operation will include an examination of what you do about brake testing, and also they will consider whether the transport management function is being undertaken correctly where brake testing or where brake defect has occurred, which they believe should have been picked up as part of the maintenance process. And a classic example here is that if you are not complying with the latest guidance, which we'll come to in a moment, on brake testing, then the transport manager will likely be considered to either be out of date, they haven't kept their own awareness up to date, and therefore their repute is at serious risk, or worse still, they are up to date, but they're unable to influence the conduct of the maintenance contractor or those senior to them on the statutory board to oblige them to conduct brake testing in line with that guidance. Either way, it's looking bleak for the transport manager. So this issue is really serious. Okay. So the expectations of the current regime are set out in the Guide to Maintaining Roadworthiness, and there is no substitute for actually looking at that guide and working through it. And I think it's important you're aware of that. But essentially, this is the current guidance on brake testing. There has to be an assessment of brake performance conducted at every safety inspection. In other words, at every preventative maintenance inspection. And this is important because there is a received wisdom out there that this only has to take place quarterly, but that is not correct. At every safety inspection, there must be an assessment of brake performance on a metered device. In orange, it says clearly here, road testing is not acceptable. So the traditional method, which many operators adopted, of just taking the vehicle out for a quick spin and locking the brakes up to check they're working on intermediate inspections, is no longer satisfactory, and indeed hasn't been for a few years now. The methodologies that you can use depend in part on whether it's a unit or a trailer. But let's start with a motor vehicle first of all. You have to conduct either a rolling road brake test or a test using a metered decelerometer, either a Tapley meter or a Beaumont device, which produces a printout report and which also and which is also calibrated. The same is true of the rolling road. The rolling road must be calibrated and in calibration. If you do the decelerometer test, you also have to conduct temperature readings on each hub prior to and immediately after the brake test on the decelerometer. And in order for that to be meaningful, the brakes need to be up to a sensible temperature. If obviously the whole thing is recording ambient temperature because the braking has been relatively minimal to get the brake test results, that is not going to be informative. The whole idea of the temperature readings is to compare the temperature before the brake test with the temperature afterwards to see if any of the axles are seriously underperforming or indeed are too hot and are potentially binding. And there's information from those temperature readings which are given. Now, a decelerometer with temperature readings is nowhere near as effective as a calibrated rolling road brake test on every axle, and it's important to recognise that. As a result of that, at least 4 times a year, the guide requires you to conduct the test on a rolling road, which and also the test must be laden. There are certain vehicles which you can conduct the test unladen, for example, refuse collection vehicles, typically because of the nature of the goods they carry, but their superstructures are so substantial, the test is meaningful anyway, And if you are conducting unladen brake tests, you have to conduct a risk assessment, which is in writing, to justify that decision. Normally, a rolling road brake test is conducted laden, and also when choosing between the decelerometer and the calibrated rolling road test on the intermediate inspections, i.e. not the 4 a year, which have to be on a rolling road, you'll find fairly quickly that your fitters will get fed up with taking temperature readings, making sure there is some heat in the system after the brake test, etc., and will probably very quickly appreciate that just doing a rolling road check at every inspection is much easier and quicker and more effective. So it is, in the end, the direction of travel which the traffic commissioners want operators to take, to use a calibrated rolling road with a laden brake test every inspection. There is one exception to all of those requirements, and that is trailers which are fitted with electronic brake performance management systems, EBPMS. If you use trailers fitted with that system, you can rely on the data from that system in lieu of either a rolling road brake test or a decelerometer test. And indeed, you can use that at every inspection, except at annual MOT, when they will still be required to be put over the rolling road as part of the MOT test. EBPMS produces its own data output, and it is important that if you're relying on EBPMS data to be satisfied that the braking systems on the trailers are in good and efficient working order, that you are downloading and printing off or digitally printing off that EBPMS data at the point of inspection prior to the signature on the PMI sheet declaring the vehicle as roadworthy. And of course, the fitter needs to be actually analysing the data, which must be meaningful. And I have clients who've gone down the EBPMS route and then decided to go back to roller road brake testing because their loads are very light, the nature of the work they do is such that they were not getting meaningful results out of the EBPMS system, and they were not confident to rely on them. So although they've installed the system and it has other benefits, because it alerts the driver to failures and so on, they went back to using calibrated rolling road brake testing. So it's not necessarily something you will want to engage in your business. It's something you're going to have to assess to see whether actually it adds value in this regard in terms of diagnostic brake testing. Okay, so the risk assessment element is set out within the Guide to Maintaining Roadworthiness. So by all means, I would encourage you to look at that guide and read it and understand what's required. The risk assessment is basically a form they're asking you to complete, which justifies the use of unladen brake testing. It does not avoid the responsibility for brake testing at all. It just avoids you having to do it laden, providing the risk assessment is justified. And normally that will be because the nature of the vehicle superstructure or the nature of the vehicle load type is such that it's just not practical to present the vehicle in a laden format. And where you're in that position, you will normally be presenting the same vehicle for MOT in the same unladen state, and it'll be accepted by the DVSA. So a quick sense check is if they will not accept that vehicle unladen for MOT, then you are unlikely to be able to present a risk assessment in lieu of a laden brake test. Okay, so, but there are vehicles, as I've already referred to, where it is generally accepted that an unladen brake test is appropriate. And one of those examples is refuse collection vehicles. Another can be certain tankers, depending on what they carry, and so on. But for that to be justified, you must complete one of the risk assessment forms contained within the guide, and that has to be completed by a competent person who understands braking systems. So it is not just the director of the business signing the form. It is a competent person who's assessing the suitability of an unladen brake test on that vehicle, producing a meaningful result, because that is underpinning this is the requirement for the brake test result to be meaningful, notwithstanding that there is insufficient weight on the vehicle. Okay. So, in terms of record keeping, you will be able to demonstrate the process that we've just discussed in the documentation retained in the vehicle records, which, as you'll be aware from your undertakings, you have to retain for a minimum of 15 months. You must show how brake performance was assessed at each PMI. Now, they do allow the rolling road check, for example, to occur before the PMI date, and it can, in fact, be up to 14 days before, which, frankly, is quite a long time. But it cannot be after the PMI date, so it can't be the following day, because once the person has signed the declaration that the vehicle is roadworthy, the traffic commissioner is taking it that that person is satisfied that the braking system is in good and efficient working order. And how can they be if the rolling road brake test hadn't been completed at that point in time? So it is important that the rolling road brake test or the EBPMS data or the decelerometer and 2 temperature test data is all available prior to that signature on the same day, ideally, or within a short period before, if it's a rolling road brake test, up to 14 days. Those records are kept with the PMI records, usually together in the same folder. Some people will have separate folders for brake test results on their computer, but they'll keep it in the same date so that when looking it up retrospectively, the DVSA officer can clearly see that brake test goes with that PMI sheet. And indeed, many people will record the brake test results on the PMI sheet. And if it's done earlier, it's sensible to record the date when it was conducted on that sheet to demonstrate it's within the window that they allow. Obviously, you have to keep the safety inspection record. You have to keep the printout of the EBPMS system in exactly the same way, and you have to keep the printout from the taplimeter or decelerometer in exactly the same way. You also have to keep the risk assessments. Now, you don't have to conduct a risk assessment every time you carry out an unladen brake test on a vehicle for which that's suitable. What you have to do is risk assess it once a year, but you should be assessing the validity of that explanation for that vehicle every time you do make the decision to carry out an unladen brake test, because things may have changed. The ability to test it or impose a load through the axles and what have you may be available, and it may be the case, therefore, that you can no longer justify the assessment that was made 6, 12, or 12 months earlier. Also, any ad hoc defects or remedial work on the braking system must obviously be recorded. Indeed, you have to record all ad hoc work on a vehicle anyway, but it's particularly important that if any work is conducted on the braking system on the vehicle, a brake test is undertaken thereafter to establish that you haven't created a further problem or that an error hasn't been made in that repair. So you will expect to see a description of the rectification work, the defect and the rectification work, together with a satisfactory, usually rolling road brake test result at that point in a laden condition. Okay. So if we look at the actual printout for roller road brake testing, one of the issues, in fact, one of the biggest issues that currently faces operators when they are dealing with a public inquiry or a DVSA maintenance investigation is that these result sheets, and this is just an illustrative one here, are not actually being used correctly by the fitters who are conducting the brake test. It's important to understand that this brake test result sheet is a model which is designed by the DVSA. It is not designed by the manufacturer of the rolling road brake test system. This is a brake test result that looks very similar to the one you'd get on annual test from an ATF testing station, and it is from an approved calibrated rolling road device, and that approval is a DVSA function. And in order to meet that approval, it must produce a brake test result that looks broadly like this, and that certainly contains the information that is contained on this one. That is required. If you have an older brake test device, or one that is not an approved device, I strongly recommend you upgrade it, because it is extremely difficult to interpret the results in a meaningful way for a fitter who's used to looking at these brake test result sheets. But it's a problem. Now, I can't go through the entire process of examining one of these brake test result sheets in a short presentation like this, but I can illustrate the issues to you. And then if you're interested, there is an hour and a half course in which we go through this in much more detail. Looking at the sheet itself, it's split into 3 sections, as you will see. The first section is the vehicle details section, and it will show the gross vehicle weight for a fully loaded vehicle or trailer, the gross train weight for a fully loaded vehicle and trailer. And by the way, those are the maximum permitted weight, not the maximum design weight. And it will also show you the trailer axle weights for fully loaded trailer axles. And that information is given in this box at the top, depending obviously whether it's a vehicle or trailer. But with it, and most importantly, is the second item down on the left-hand side, which is the DTP code. That code is taken from the plating certificate of the vehicle and should match perfectly. If there's an error in that code, you will get a spurious result within the brake test results below. And indeed, maybe the gross vehicle weight, gross train weight, and trailer axle weight figures will be incorrect or incomplete. That code is vital. And indeed, I had a client who had, in one brake test result on one device, because they used multiple suppliers, the fitter had input by 1 letter an incorrect DTP code. The result was that there was no secondary brake test result, and that is a diagnostic feature. If you don't have the correct DTP number, or you have no DTP number, you shouldn't be getting a secondary brake test result off this device. The secondary brake test being a calculation based on the primary brake, the service brake results. And as a result of that, it's very indicative there's a problem with the DTP code if you haven't got a secondary brake test result on one of these features. So that you can see by looking right at the bottom in the 3rd section of the sheet. It says here secondary brake, and it gives you the figures. All right, so that's just one example of the diagnostic systems that are contained within this standard report. In the middle of the report, you can see there's a series of issues. There is the weight, which is the weight on each individual wheel. To the left, there is the axle weight, which is the combination of those 2 figures added together, and gives you the total weight on that axle as presented on the rolling road. There is a test called bind, and if it's more than 4% binding, which means what it says, then it will fail. There is time lag, which is just the fitter assessing how long it's taking from pedal push to brake actuation. It's a judgment of the inspecting fitter. There is an ovality check. Again, there is a standard it must meet. There is an imbalance check, which is obviously across the axle. The brakes are coming on at slightly different points, and you can see, looking at the brake test results on the left-hand side, 1%, 23%, 27% imbalance. They're only interested in balance actually on the service brake and secondary braking system, but you will see by looking at the imbalance figures whether there is a problem across an axle. Now, often where the brakes lock up, the imbalance is less relevant, but it's very important that it's not ignored. And this is a really important point. If you look down at the beginning of the 3rd section here, you'll see it says insufficient load on axle 2. That means that the weight on the 2nd axle is inadequate. It doesn't meet 65% of the design weight on that axle at the point when the vehicle was weighed. And that's either because there is no load on the vehicle or there is inadequate load on the vehicle. And this is a very common issue with presentation results. Nonetheless, if you look at the bottom, it will say overall result passed. And the problem with brake test results at the moment is that many fitters are just looking at that bottom result figure, and they are not looking at the data contained in the box in the middle, and or indeed in any of the three boxes, to check they all make sense and they're appropriate for that vehicle. And that is a big issue. If you have an insufficient load on an axle, you are going to need a risk assessment which is justified for unladen or lightly laden brake testing. And therefore, you should not be expecting to see insufficient load if you're presenting vehicles expecting a laden brake test. And it can happen simply because the positioning of the load on the vehicle is too far forward or too far back, the imposed load. So it's not always the case that there's actually a problem with the load per se. There might be plenty on the vehicle. It's just distributed incorrectly for the purpose of getting a meaningful weight check. But if the fitter's looking at the report, they will see that because it will tell them. And they can't look at overall result past and think that everything's okay. It isn't. They need to move the load to eliminate the insufficient load and then represent it. More importantly than that even is they have to look at the results in the middle, whether even if it's a perfect brake test in terms of the weight of the vehicle on the axles, the results in the middle are diagnostic. Remember, on PMI, you are not just looking to see whether it would pass an MOT test at that moment in time, which is what the overall result pass means, subject to there not being insufficient weight on the vehicle. What you're looking at is the vehicle going to be fit for use on the road in, say, 6 weeks' time when the next PMI crops up? And that is that involves a judgment based on the results. So if it just passes the brake test result because there's imbalance which is just below 30%, or for any number of other reasons the percentages are diminished, but it just passes, then it's rather like taking a vehicle on the road with 1.1 millimetre of tread on the tyres. Yes, it will pass a test like that. You'll get an advisory, but it'll pass its test because the test minimum for goods vehicles is 1 millimetre of tread. But it's not suitable for use on the road for the next 6 weeks. That tyre needs replacing. Well, it's exactly the same with brake test results. If you're marginal when you're looking at those figures in the middle, and really it means there's a problem, chances are that problem is going to manifest itself over the next 6 weeks. And this is the whole point of this presentation and training on this subject. It's absolutely critical that the fitters are looking at the brake test results in a meaningful way, using it as a diagnostic tool to anticipate the condition of the braking system 6 weeks or whenever the next PMI is. It might be 12 weeks on some logistics vehicles. Hence, it is not the case that you look at the overall results. In fact, it shouldn't even say, in my opinion, overall result passed, where there are, for example, insufficient loads or a missing DTP code declared on the form. It'd be much better if that wasn't there at all. There are amendments to this form and to brake test updates coming up this year, so it'll be interesting to see how that changes the form, if at all. But broadly speaking, the lesson is fitters need to be looking at this. As a transport manager or a director of a business, it is your role to make sure that you understand whether in fact this has been looked at meaningfully by the fitters when it's returned to you. And in order to do that, your transport managers particularly need to have a decent understanding of what the information is, and need to be able to work this form and this standard format in a similar way to the fitters. It is not rocket science, and there is a DFT guide on how to understand your brake test results, which is available free online. But for those that need a little bit more explanation, which are many, then we do offer a course for that. And it's important that your transport managers, as well as the fitters, understand what the brake test result means and how to interpret it. Also important is the EBPMS data has the same characteristics. It does not present the form in anything like the same format, but it does have the same characteristics in that it's important that the fitters are looking at it diagnostically with a view to assessing the braking system on that trailer for the next operational period until the next PMI, not just looking for the pass on the day. It is not an MOT test. It should be well above the minimum standard, which is the MOT standard. Okay. So hopefully you've gained a fair bit from that. The essence of it is you need to take regular brake performance tests at every PMI. In the methodologies that we've discussed, you need to have laden brake testing, and that might involve a plan. And it's to enable that to be done that they allow the 14 days before the roller road brake test, before the PMI, when a rolling road brake test can be undertaken. So it is so that you can plan and load over the testing facility. You need to obtain the relevant records from the fitters and the device that's being used. You need to understand what those records are telling you and be satisfied that the fitters are actually using the diagnostic information on it, which means particularly a transport manager needs to properly understand the brake test result sheet. Remember, the objective of all this is to avoid a bath tipper lorry crash happening with one of your vehicles through poor maintenance or poor maintenance assessment. Had that vehicle been put over a rolling road, one would anticipate the brake test result wouldn't have produced a satisfactory outcome. And if there are concerns within the system, in one of two ways: one, if there are concerns with the braking system, obviously you expect the fitters to repair that and record it and retest it. But if there are concerns from your point of view that the fitters are not examining the reports correctly, then absolutely you have to get onto your contractor or your in-house team and you have to work through what your expectation is in line with the Guide to Maintaining Roadworthiness. If you're interested in further training on this subject, then we have a number of courses relating to maintenance and one specifically relating to brake testing on the backacademy.com website, and the QR code on the right here will take you to that website. I hope you've enjoyed it, and thank you for listening.